They say a mother's love knows no bounds, but I never imagined that love could become my prison. My name is Miriam, and I'm 55 years old. For the past 6 months, I've been living in what they call a care facility, but it feels more like a tomb where they bury inconvenient women who dare to question their own sons. I wake up every morning to the sound of pills rattling in a plastic cup. The nurse, a young woman with tired eyes, watches me swallow each one. "For your own good," she says, the same phrase Lucas used when he first brought me here. But these pills don't heal. They steal. They steal my thoughts, my words, my ability to remember why I'm fighting. 6 months ago, I was living in my own home, the house I bought with 30 years of nursing wages. Every corner held memories of raising Lucas alone after his father abandoned us when he was 3. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and wore the same coat for 5 winters so my boy could have everything he needed. I thought I was building something beautiful, a foundation of love and sacrifice that would last forever. But love, I've learned, can be one-sided even between a mother and child. The morning everything changed started like any other. I was making coffee in my kitchen when Lucas arrived unannounced with a man in an expensive suit. "Mom, this is Dr. Patterson," he said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, cold, clinical, like I was already a problem to be solved rather than his mother. Dr. Patterson shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that felt more like a trap. He asked questions about my sleep, my memory, my daily routines. Normal questions that felt wrong coming from a stranger in my own kitchen while my son stood behind him, nodding at answers I hadn't even given yet. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your son is concerned about some behavioral changes," Dr. Patterson said, scribbling notes on a pad I couldn't see. "Have you been feeling confused lately? Forgetting things? Having trouble managing your finances?" I looked at Lucas, searching his face for the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who cried when I worked late shifts because he missed me. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes held something I couldn't recognize, something that made my stomach turn with a fear I couldn't name. "I'm fine," I said, but my voice sounded smaller than I intended. "I've been taking care of myself for 55 years. I think I know my own mind." Lucas stepped forward then, and when he spoke, his words cut through my heart like broken glass. "Mom, you called me 17 times last Tuesday asking the same question. You forgot you had a doctor's appointment and missed it completely. Last week you accused Mrs. Henderson of stealing your mail when it was sitting on your kitchen counter. None of that was true. I knew it wasn't true. But the way he said it, with such conviction, such concern in his voice, made me doubt my own memory for just a moment. And in that moment of doubt, I saw Dr. Patterson make another note. "If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and reveal the strength of the human spirit, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work continue. And comment below to let us know what city you're watching from." The visit lasted an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Dr. Patterson asked about my medications, my eating habits, whether I'd been seeing things that weren't there. Every question felt like a trap. Every answer I gave seemed to confirm something terrible in his mind. When they left, I stood in my empty kitchen and tried to understand what had just happened. The house felt different somehow, as if strangers had been through it and rearranged something I couldn't identify. I called my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, to ask if she'd noticed anything strange about my behavior. "Miriam, honey," she said, her voice gentle but worried. "You've seemed perfectly fine to me. A little tired, maybe, but who isn't at our age? Why do you ask?" I couldn't tell her about the visit, couldn't explain the feeling that something terrible was being set in motion. Instead, I thanked her and hung up, then sat at my kitchen table and tried to remember every detail of the conversation with Dr. Patterson. I wrote it all down in a notebook, every question, every answer, every look that passed between the doctor and my son. Looking back now, with whatever clarity these medications haven't stolen, I realized that was the day Lucas began erasing me. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he started small, planting seeds of doubt about my competence, my memory, my ability to care for myself. 3 days later, he returned with papers for me to sign. "Just some updates to your medical information," he said, spreading documents across my dining room table. In case of emergency, I'll be your medical power of attorney. It's standard stuff, Mom. Everyone our age should have these things in order. I trusted him. God help me. I signed those papers because I trusted my own son. Within a week, Dr. Patterson had prescribed medications for my anxiety and memory issues. Lucas picked them up from the pharmacy and brought them to me personally, explaining how important it was that I take them exactly as prescribed. "These will help you feel better, Mom," he said, arranging the pill bottles on my counter like a pharmacist. "Dr. Patterson says your symptoms are very common for women your age. The medication will clear up the confusion, but the pills didn't clear anything up. They made everything worse. The pills turned my world into a fog." Within 2 weeks of starting Dr. Patterson's medication, I could barely remember what I'd eaten for breakfast, let alone manage the sharp conversations Lucas seemed determined to have with me about my declining condition. He visited more frequently now, always with that same concerned expression, always asking questions that felt like tests I was destined to fail. "Mom, do you remember what we talked about yesterday?" he'd ask. And when I struggled to recall the specifics through the pharmaceutical haze clouding my thoughts, he'd shake his head with manufactured sadness. "We discussed selling the house, remember? You agreed it was too much for you to handle alone." I never agreed to anything of the sort. But the medications made me doubt everything, made me question whether my memories were real or just fragments of dreams I couldn't distinguish from reality. When I tried to protest, my words came out slurred and uncertain, making me sound exactly like the confused old woman he was painting me to be. Lucas began bringing witnesses to these conversations. His girlfriend Rebecca, his colleague from the insurance company where he worked, even Dr. Patterson himself. They'd sit in my living room, the room where I'd read Lucas bedtime stories and helped him with homework, and discuss my situation as if I weren't there. "She's getting worse," Lucas would say, speaking about me in third person while I sat 3 feet away. "Yesterday she called me crying, saying someone had broken into her house and stolen her jewelry. When I came over, everything was exactly where it belonged. She'd simply forgotten where she'd put her grandmother's ring." The lie was so specific, so detailed, that even I began to wonder if it had happened. The medications made everything feel dreamlike and uncertain. Had I called him crying? Had I lost my grandmother's ring? I touched my finger where the ring should be, and for a terrifying moment I couldn't remember taking it off. Rebecca, a woman 20 years younger than Lucas with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes I'd never be able to afford, would nod sympathetically during these discussions. "It must be so hard for you, Lucas," she'd say, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Taking care of an aging parent is such a burden." Burden. The word hit me like a physical blow every time she said it. I wanted to remind them that I'd raised Lucas alone, that I'd worked 3 jobs to put him through college, that I'd never once called him a burden even when he dropped out after 2 years and moved back home for 8 months. But the medications made my tongue feel thick and unresponsive, my thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. Dr. Patterson would observe me during these visits with the detached interest of a scientist studying a specimen. He'd make notes while I struggled to follow conversations that seemed to move too fast for my drugged mind to process. When I tried to speak up, to defend myself, my words came out wrong, jumbled, confused, proving his point better than any lie Lucas could tell. "As you can see," Dr. Patterson would say, clicking his pen closed, "the cognitive decline is progressing rapidly. Mrs. Rodriguez, can you tell me what day it is?" I'd look around the room at faces that had become blurry and hostile and struggle to remember. Tuesday? Wednesday? The days had become meaningless since I'd stopped working, since I'd stopped having a life beyond waiting for Lucas's visits and choking down pills that seemed designed to steal my mind piece by piece. "See?" Lucas would say when I couldn't answer. "This is what I'm dealing with. She can't be trusted to live alone anymore." My neighbors began to avoid me. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been my friend for 15 years, started crossing the street when she saw me checking my mail. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her why, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "Lucas told us about your condition, Miriam," she said, her voice gentle but distant. "He said you've been having episodes that you might not remember things correctly. He asked us to call him if we noticed anything concerning." Episodes. The word felt like a diagnosis, a label that explained away anything I might say or do that didn't fit Lucas's narrative. If I claimed I was being drugged against my will, it was an episode. If I insisted I'd never agreed to sell my house, it was confusion caused by my declining mental state. I began to understand how easily a person could be disappeared, not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through a systematic campaign of doubt and medication. Lucas was erasing me with paperwork and pills, with concerned phone calls to neighbors and carefully documented conversations with medical professionals. The worst part wasn't the fog in my mind, or the way my hands shook from the medication side effects. The worst part was watching my son, the boy I'd loved more than my own life, transform into someone I didn't recognize. He spoke about me with clinical detachment, as if our shared history meant nothing, as if the 32 years I'd spent raising him had been erased along with my credibility. During one particularly cruel visit, he brought photo albums to my living room and began removing pictures. "I'm just organizing these for you, Mom," he said, pulling out photographs of my parents, my sister, old friends from nursing school. Too many pictures can be overwhelming when you're dealing with memory issues. I watched him pack away my history, my proof that I'd had a life before this nightmare began. When I tried to stop him to reach for a photograph of my mother holding infant Lucas, he gently moved my hand away. "Mom, you need to trust me to make these decisions now," he said, his voice patient but firm. "Dr. Patterson agrees that too much stimulation can worsen your symptoms." That night, after Lucas left with a box full of my memories, I sat in my bedroom and tried to remember my mother's face without the photographs to help me. The medication made even my oldest memories feel uncertain, as if my entire past was being edited by someone else. I found myself checking and rechecking things obsessively. Had I locked the door, turned off the stove, fed my cat, Whiskers? The doubt was poisonous, making me question every action, every memory, every instinct. When I couldn't remember if I'd taken my morning pills, I'd sometimes take them again, which only made the fog worse. Lucas noticed my increasing confusion with satisfaction rather than concern. "You see how bad it's getting?" he'd tell Dr. Patterson during their frequent consultations. "She's a danger to herself now. Last week I found her oven on with nothing in it. She could have burned down the house." Another lie, but one I couldn't prove false through the haze of pharmaceutical interference. The medications had made me their accomplice in my own disappearance, turning my own mind into evidence against me. The morning Lucas brought the realtor to my house, I knew my time was running out. I was sitting in my kitchen, struggling to remember if I'd already taken my morning pills, when I heard unfamiliar voices in my living room. Through the pharmaceutical fog that had become my constant companion, I recognized Lucas's voice mixed with others I didn't know. "As you can see, the property has good bones," a woman was saying, her high heels clicking across my hardwood floors. "With some updating, this could easily sell for market value." I stumbled into the living room, my legs unsteady from the medications, and found 3 strangers examining my home like vultures evaluating carrion. The realtor, a sharp-dressed woman with calculating eyes, was measuring my walls with a laser device while taking notes on a tablet. 2 other people, a man and woman in matching polo shirts, were discussing paint colors and fixture replacements as if I were already dead. "Mom," Lucas said, his voice bright with false cheer. "Perfect timing. I want you to meet Sandra from Prestige Properties. She's going to help us with the house sale we discussed." We'd never discussed selling my house, but when I tried to say this, the words came out garbled and confused, my tongue thick from the morning medications. This is my home. Sandra looked at me with the practiced sympathy of someone accustomed to dealing with inconvenient relatives. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand this is a difficult transition, but Lucas has explained your situation, and honestly, this house is far too much for someone in your condition to maintain." My condition. Everyone seemed to know about my condition except me. According to Lucas, I'd agreed to this sale during one of my lucid moments, though I had no memory of any such conversation. The realtor had contracts ready for my signature, documents that would transfer ownership to Lucas so he could handle the sale in my best interests. "I don't want to sell," I managed to say, gripping the doorframe to steady myself. "This is my home. I bought it. I worked 30 years to pay for it. Lucas exchanged a look with Sandra that I was clearly meant to see. A look that said, "See what I'm dealing with?" He guided me to my own couch with gentle but firm hands, positioning me like a confused child who needed managing. "Mom, we've been over this," he said, his voice patient but with an edge of irritation. "The house is too big, too expensive to maintain. You can't handle the stairs anymore. And what if you fall and no one finds you for days? The assisted living facility I found has 24-hour care and activities designed for people with memory issues." Assisted living facility. This was the first I'd heard of any facility. But Lucas spoke as if we'd toured it together, as if I'd approved of this plan during some conversation the medications had erased from my mind. The contracts Sandra spread across my coffee table made it real. Papers that would dissolve my life into legal language and property transfers. "I need you to sign here," Sandra said, pointing to signature lines with the efficiency of someone who processed elderly displacement as a routine business transaction. "Lucas will handle everything from here. You won't have to worry about any of the details." My hand shook as I stared at the papers. Through the fog, some part of my mind screamed warnings, but the medications made everything feel distant and unreal. Was I being dramatic? Was Lucas right that I couldn't care for myself anymore? The doubt was poison, making me question every instinct that told me this was wrong. I need time to think," I said, pushing the papers away. Lucas's patience finally cracked. Just slightly. "Mom, we don't have time. Sandra has buyers interested, and the facility has a waiting list. If we don't move quickly, you'll lose this opportunity." Opportunity. He made homelessness sound like a gift he was giving me. But something in his tone, a sharpness that reminded me of his father's voice during our worst arguments, cut through the pharmaceutical haze enough for me to recognize manipulation. "No," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I'm not signing anything today." The room fell silent. Sandra gathered her papers with barely concealed annoyance, muttering something about difficult clients and family dynamics. The potential buyers left without another word, but Lucas remained, and when the door closed behind them, his mask of concerned son finally slipped. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, no longer bothering with gentle tones. "Do you want to end up in county care? Because that's what happens to people who can't make rational decisions about their future." County care. The threat hung in the air like a death sentence. I'd seen the county facility during my nursing career. Overcrowded, understaffed, a place where people went to die forgotten. Lucas knew exactly how terrifying that prospect would be for me. That night, after he left, I tried to call my sister Maria in Phoenix. We hadn't spoken in months. Lucas had told me she was too busy with her own problems to worry about mine, but I needed to hear a familiar voice, someone who knew me before I became this confused, medicated version of myself. The phone rang 4 times before Maria answered. "Miriam, is everything okay? It's so late." "Maria," I said, relief flooding through me at the sound of her voice. "I need help. Lucas is trying to sell my house, and I think something's wrong with the medications Dr. Patterson prescribed." There was a long pause. When Maria spoke again, her voice was careful, distant. "Miriam, Lucas called me last month. He told me about your diagnosis, about the memory problems and the paranoid episodes. He said you might call with wild stories." Wild stories. Even my own sister had been poisoned against me. Lucas had been thorough, reaching out to my family and friends before I even knew I needed defending. He'd painted me as delusional before I'd realized I was under attack. "This isn't paranoia," I said, desperation making my voice crack. "He's drugging me, Maria. The pills make me confused, and he's using that confusion to steal everything I own." "Honey," Maria said, her tone gentle but dismissive, "that's exactly the kind of thing Lucas said you might believe. Memory loss can cause paranoid thoughts. You need to trust the doctors. Trust your son. He loves you." After she hung up, I sat in my dark kitchen and understood the completeness of my isolation. Lucas had anticipated every move, contacted every person who might have helped me. He'd turned my love for him into a weapon against me, using my trust to destroy my credibility before I even knew I was fighting for my life. The next morning, I found Whiskers, my 10-year-old tabby cat, lying motionless by his food bowl. The vet later said it was kidney failure, common in older cats, but the timing felt like another small cruelty. Even my pet, the one creature who depended on me and loved me unconditionally, was being taken away. Lucas arranged the burial with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. "I know how much Whiskers meant to you, Mom," he said, watching the veterinary assistant carry away the small wrapped body. "But honestly, caring for a pet was probably too much stress in your condition anyway." Standing in my backyard, watching them bury my cat in a grave I'd never chosen, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break. That would have been cleaner. This was more like a foundation giving way slowly, the structural damage of too much weight placed on supports that were never meant to bear such betrayal. That evening, alone in a house that no longer felt like home, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to remember who I used to be before the medications, before the doubt, before my own son decided I was worth more dead than alive. The woman I'd been seemed like a character from a story someone had told me long ago. Strong, independent, capable of fighting her own battles. But somewhere inside the fog, she was still there, and she was getting angry. The day Lucas had me committed to Riverside Behavioral Health, I was wearing the same yellow sweater I'd knitted for myself 3 winters ago, when I still believed in planning for the future. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd created something beautiful with my own hands, and now those same hands were being restrained with soft fabric cuffs as orderlies guided me into a facility that looked more like a prison than a place of healing. "It's temporary, Mom," Lucas said, his voice carrying that practiced concern that had become his trademark. "Just until we can get your medications adjusted and find you a permanent placement. Dr. Patterson thinks a controlled environment will help stabilize your condition." My condition. That phrase had become the explanation for everything. Why I couldn't remember conversations that never happened. Why I couldn't manage a house I'd maintained for 15 years. Why I needed to be locked away from the world that had known me as competent and strong. The admission process was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. A nurse with dead eyes took my personal belongings. My wedding ring, my mother's rosary, even the small photo of Lucas as a child that I'd kept in my wallet for 27 years. Everything went into a plastic bag labeled with my name and a patient number that would replace my identity for the foreseeable future. "No personal items in the rooms," the nurse explained with bureaucratic efficiency. "Safety protocol. You can request supervised access during designated hours." Supervised access to my own memories. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't destroying what remained of my sanity. My room was a sterile box with one window that looked out onto a parking lot where normal people came and went freely. The bed was narrow and institutional, covered with sheets that smelled like industrial bleach. A small plastic chair sat beside a bolted-down desk, and the bathroom door had no lock. Privacy was apparently another privilege I'd forfeited when I became inconveniently aware of my own abuse. The other patients on my ward were genuine cases. Elderly people with advanced dementia who called for their mothers, younger adults with psychiatric conditions that made them pace the hallways talking to voices only they could hear. I was the anomaly, the one whose only illness was trusting her son too completely. During my first group therapy session, led by a social worker named Janet, who spoke in the artificially cheerful tone of someone who'd never experienced real trauma, I tried to explain my situation. The words came out wrong, of course. The medications made everything sound paranoid and confused. "I'm not supposed to be here," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion and desperation. "My son is stealing my house. The doctor is giving me drugs that make me confused. I was fine before all this started." Janet nodded with practiced sympathy. "Denial is very common, Miriam. Family members often have to make difficult decisions when we can't see our own limitations clearly. The important thing is focusing on your recovery." Recovery from what? From being systematically poisoned and gaslit by my own child? But I could see in Janet's eyes the same look I'd seen in everyone else. The patient understanding reserved for delusional elderly women who didn't know their own minds. The daily routine was designed to break whatever spirit remained in people like me. Medications at 7 a.m., breakfast at 8, group therapy at 10, lunch at noon, recreation time in a windowless room with puzzles missing pieces and books with pages torn out. Dinner at 5, more medication at 8. Lights out at 9 p.m. like children who couldn't be trusted to manage their own sleep schedules. But the worst part wasn't the institutional routine or the loss of freedom. The worst part was visiting hours, when Lucas would arrive with flowers and concerned expressions, playing the role of devoted son for the staff while systematically erasing everything I'd ever owned or valued. "I sold the house, Mom," he told me during one particularly devastating visit, his voice gentle as he delivered the news that made my world collapse entirely. "The buyers made a cash offer, and Sandra thought we should accept it quickly. The market could change, and we needed to secure your future while we could." My future. He'd sold my past and called it my future. "Where will I live?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be another cage with a different name. "I found a lovely place called Golden Years Manor," he said, showing me a brochure with smiling, elderly people engaged in craft activities. "It's specifically designed for people with memory issues. You'll have your own room, meals provided, activities to keep you engaged, and it's only 20 minutes from my house, so I can visit regularly." 20 minutes might as well have been 20,000 miles. Lucas had never visited regularly when I lived in my own home, when I was healthy and independent, and could have enjoyed his company. Now that I was broken and medicated, and no longer a threat to his plans, he promised proximity as if it were a gift rather than supervision. "What about my things?" I whispered, thinking of the furniture I'd saved for, the photo albums he'd been organizing, the lifetime of memories stored in closets and drawers. "I kept what was important," he said, and something in his tone suggested that very little had qualified as important enough to preserve. "The rest went to charity. You won't need much in your new place. They provide everything. They provide everything except dignity, autonomy, or the right to exist in the world as an independent human being." But I couldn't say that through the fog of medications that made every coherent thought feel like climbing a mountain. That night, lying on the narrow institutional bed while the night shift nurse made her rounds, I tried to remember my house room by room. The kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, the living room where I'd watched Lucas take his first steps, the bedroom where I'd cried alone after his father left, the garden where I'd planted roses that would bloom for someone else now. All of it gone. 30 years of mortgage payments, 30 years of maintenance and improvement and love, reduced to a real estate transaction that would fund my own imprisonment. The medications they gave me at Riverside were stronger than anything Dr. Patterson had prescribed. "For your agitation," the staff psychiatrist explained when I complained about the increased drowsiness and confusion. "Your son was right to be concerned about your behavioral changes. These will help stabilize your mood." Stabilize my mood. Code 4, silence your protests. Eliminate your ability to fight back. Turn you into a compliant shell of your former self. I began to understand that this was the end game. Lucas didn't just want my money. He wanted me erased completely. The house sale would fund my care until I died, hopefully soon, and he'd inherit whatever remained. Meanwhile, I'd spend my final years drugged into submission, labeled as mentally incompetent, unable to tell anyone what had really happened. During one of my increasingly rare lucid moments, I managed to corner a young orderly named David, who seemed different from the others. Less jaded, more human. "Can you help me make a phone call?" I asked, gripping his arm with desperate strength. "I need to call a lawyer. My son is stealing everything I own." David looked around nervously, then leaned closer. "Ma'am, I could lose my job. Patients aren't supposed to have outside contact without family approval." "Please," I whispered, tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally breaking free. I was a nurse for 30 years. I worked in places like this. I know the difference between a patient who needs help and one who's being silenced. I'm not crazy. I'm being destroyed. Something in my voice must have convinced him, because David hesitated before shaking his head. "I'm sorry. I can't." But he glanced around again, then spoke so quietly I had to strain to hear. "There's a patient advocate who visits on Thursdays. Patricia Summers. If you could get on her list somehow." But Thursday came and went without any advocate visit. When I asked about Patricia Summers, the staff looked at me with confusion. No one had heard of any patient advocate named Patricia. David avoided my eyes when our paths crossed, and I realized that even my one potential ally had either lied to me or been silenced. The weeks blurred together in a haze of medications and institutional routine. I stopped asking about discharge dates or treatment plans. I stopped protesting when nurses brought pills I didn't recognize. I stopped crying during Lucas's visits, stopped asking about my possessions or my rights or my future. From the outside, I probably looked like I was getting better, more compliant, less agitated, accepting of my circumstances. But inside, in the small corner of my mind that the medications couldn't quite reach, something was changing, not breaking, something harder, sharper, more dangerous than the grief and confusion I'd been drowning in. I was learning to hide, learning to smile and nod while memorizing every detail of my imprisonment, learning to swallow pills that might or might not be necessary while keeping my real thoughts locked away, where no one could medicate them into submission. Because I had something Lucas had forgotten about, something he'd dismissed as unimportant when he'd cataloged my possessions and decided what was worth preserving. I had my nursing training, and I was beginning to remember things he wished I'd forget. 3 months into my imprisonment at Riverside, I started pretending to take my morning medications. It began by accident, a moment of distraction when the nurse was called away and I instinctively tucked the pills under my tongue, instead of swallowing them. When she returned and marked my chart as compliant, I realized I'd discovered something precious. The possibility of thinking clearly again. The technique required practice. I learned to hold the pills in the pocket of my cheek, to mimic the swallowing motion while keeping them dry, to smile and open my mouth for inspection while hiding what I needed to hide. During my 30 years as a nurse, I'd caught patients doing exactly this, but I'd never understood the desperation that drove such deception. Now, I understood everything. As the pharmaceutical fog began to lift gradually, day by careful day, I started to remember who I used to be. Not the confused, helpless woman Lucas had created, but Miriam Rodriguez, RN, who had worked in psychiatric facilities, who understood medication protocols, who knew the difference between therapeutic treatment and chemical restraint. The medications they were giving me weren't healing anything. The combination of antipsychotics and sedatives was designed to create exactly the symptoms Lucas needed to prove my incompetence. Dr. Patterson had prescribed a cocktail that would make anyone appear confused, paranoid, and incapable of rational thought. In a genuine psychiatric patient, these medications might be necessary. In someone like me, they were weapons. I began to study the staff routines with the methodical attention I'd once brought to patient care. Nurse Caroline worked the day shift and was thorough but overworked, responsible for 16 patients on a ward designed for 12. She relied on efficiency rather than attention to detail, marking charts quickly and moving on to the next crisis. Nurse Marcus handled evenings and was more observant, but he was also studying for his nurse practitioner degree and spent most of his shift buried in textbooks. The night nurse, Helen, was my best opportunity. She was 62 years old, tired from 40 years of institutional nursing, and genuinely kind in ways that hadn't been worn away by decades of dealing with psychiatric patients. More importantly, she'd mentioned during casual conversation that her own mother had been placed in memory care against her will by a brother who just wanted to get his hands on the farm. Late one evening, when Helen was making her midnight rounds, I pretended to wake up confused and disoriented, the performance Lucas had taught me to give without realizing it. "Helen," I whispered, gripping her hand with the desperation that no longer had to be feigned. "Something's wrong. I feel so much clearer tonight, like the fog is lifting. But I'm scared. If I tell anyone I'm getting better, will they increase my medications?" Helen sat on the edge of my bed, something she wasn't supposed to do but did anyway because her humanity had survived longer than her strict adherence to protocol. "Honey, why would you be scared of getting better? That's the goal." "Because," I said, allowing tears to flow freely, "I don't think I was supposed to get better. My son, the things he's done, I think he needs me to stay confused." I told her everything, not in the rambling, paranoid way that medications had forced me to communicate before, but with the clear, systematic presentation of facts that any nurse would recognize as credible. I explained the timeline, my health before Dr. Patterson, the sudden onset of symptoms that coincided with medication, the convenient progression of my decline that matched exactly with Lucas's need to gain control of my assets. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled as I continued. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Miriam," she said finally, "what you're describing, it would be elder abuse. It would be criminal." "I know," I said. "But who would believe me? Look where I am. Look at my medical records. Lucas has been very careful to document everything that supports his story and ignore everything that doesn't." Helen was quiet again, thinking with the methodical approach of a nurse who'd learned to trust her instincts about patients. "Your medication list," she said slowly. "It's unusually aggressive for someone with your presentation. I've seen patients with advanced dementia on lighter protocols." That was the moment I knew I'd found an ally. Helen understood psychiatric medications, understood that what I was being given didn't match what my chart claimed I needed. She'd noticed the discrepancies but hadn't questioned them, because the orders came from doctors and family members who were supposed to have my best interests at heart. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. And those 7 words gave me the first real hope I'd felt in months. "Help me document everything," I said. "Help me prove that I'm competent when I'm not being chemically restrained. And help me figure out how to get someone in authority to listen." Helen's help was subtle, but crucial. She began noting in my chart when I was particularly alert and coherent during her shifts. She documented conversations we had that demonstrated clear thinking and appropriate emotional responses. She took photographs of the medications I was prescribed versus what patients with similar diagnoses typically received. More importantly, she helped me write. During the long, quiet hours of her night shifts, when the ward was settled and she had time between patient checks, Helen would sit with me and help me document everything I could remember about Lucas's systematic campaign to destroy my competence. We wrote about the timeline of events, the sudden introduction of Dr. Patterson, the medications that appeared immediately after I'd signed power of attorney documents I'd been told were routine. We documented every lie Lucas had told about my behavior, every witness he'd brought to observe my decline, every step in the process that had led to my institutionalization. "The pattern is too clean," Helen observed as we reviewed what we'd written. "Real cognitive decline doesn't happen this quickly or this conveniently, and real family members don't usually push this hard for institutionalization unless there's been some kind of crisis event." She was right. Lucas's story fell apart under scrutiny because it was designed to convince people who weren't looking too closely, people who trusted that sons didn't systematically abuse their mothers for financial gain. But I needed more than Helen's observations and my own testimony. I needed someone with legal authority to investigate, someone who couldn't be dismissed as easily as a suspicious nurse or a supposedly delusional patient. The opportunity came when Helen mentioned that the state health department conducted periodic reviews of psychiatric facilities, including interviews with patients who requested them. These reviews were designed to identify abuse and ensure that patients' rights were being protected. "The next review is scheduled for next month," Helen told me during one of our clandestine documentation sessions. "I can put your name on the list for individual interviews, but you'll need to be completely clear and coherent when they talk to you. No room for doubt." I had 4 weeks to prepare. 4 weeks to continue secretly refusing medications while maintaining the appearance of compliance. 4 weeks to organize my thoughts and evidence into a presentation that would convince skeptical officials that I was the victim of elaborate criminal conspiracy rather than a delusional elderly woman with persecution fantasies. During the day, I continued to play the role Lucas had created for me. I attended group therapy sessions and nodded along with treatment plans that were designed to keep me sedated and compliant. I accepted visits from him where he updated me on the progress he was making in settling my affairs, which meant spending the money from my house sale on my continued incarceration. But at night, when Helen was on duty and the other patients were asleep, I became myself again. I remembered my training, my experience, my ability to think clearly and strategically about complex problems. I planned what I would say and how I would say it. I prepared for what might be my only chance to save myself from disappearing completely into the system Lucas had created to contain me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the same skills that had made me a good nurse: attention to detail, ability to observe and document, understanding of medical protocols and institutional systems, to fight for my freedom from the very type of institution where I'd once worked. But this time, I wasn't caring for other people. I was fighting for my own life, my own sanity, my own right to exist in the world as something more than a convenient source of income for a son who'd forgotten that I was human. The state reviewer's visit was scheduled for a Tuesday in November. As that date approached, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year: hope mixed with determination instead of hope mixed with desperation. Because I wasn't just a confused old woman anymore. I was a nurse with 40 years of experience, and I was about to remind everyone what that meant. The state reviewer arrived on a gray Tuesday morning that felt heavy with possibility and danger. Dr. Amanda Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me of the best residents I'd worked with during my nursing career. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd learned to see through institutional facades and wasn't easily impressed by official explanations. Helen had warned me that the administration would try to present me as one of their success stories, a difficult patient who'd responded well to treatment and was now much more stable than when I'd arrived. Dr. Patterson had been called in specifically for this review, and I could see him in the hallway outside the conference room where interviews were being conducted, adjusting his tie and reviewing my chart with the nervous energy of someone whose reputation was about to be examined. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen said when my turn came, settling across from me at a small table in a room that smelled like disinfectant and desperation. "How are you feeling about your treatment here at Riverside?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. This was my moment, possibly my only moment, to convince someone in authority that I was the victim of systematic abuse rather than a beneficiary of necessary medical care. Everything depended on how clearly I could think, how coherently I could speak, how convincingly I could present evidence that contradicted months of official documentation. "Dr. Chen," I said, looking directly into her eyes with the steady gaze I'd once used to communicate confidence to worried patients' families, "I need to tell you something that may sound impossible, but I believe you'll understand once you hear the full story." She leaned back slightly, and I could see her shifting into a more analytical mode. State reviewers heard complaints from patients regularly, most of them legitimate grievances about food quality or visiting hours, some of them delusional accusations that reflected genuine psychiatric symptoms. She was preparing to categorize my concerns before I'd even voiced them. "Before I was brought here," I continued, "I was a registered nurse for 30 years. I worked in facilities like this one. I understand psychiatric medications, treatment protocols, and the difference between therapeutic intervention and chemical restraint. What's been done to me here, and what was done to me before I arrived, constitutes elder abuse and fraud." Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but I saw her make a note on her pad. The fact that I'd identified myself as a healthcare professional with relevant experience had shifted something in her assessment. She was listening more carefully now. I told her everything, but not in the desperate, scattered way I might have 3 months earlier when the medications were controlling my thoughts. Instead, I presented my case with the systematic clarity I'd once brought to shift reports, organizing the information chronologically and providing specific details that could be verified. "The timeline is crucial," I explained, pulling out the notes Helen and I had compiled during our midnight sessions. "I was completely functional until January 15th, when my son brought Dr. Patterson to my home without advance notice. Within 1 week, I was prescribed medications that made me confused and disoriented. Within 1 month, he'd gained power of attorney. Within 3 months, he'd sold my house. Within 6 months, I was here." Dr. Chen examined the medication list I'd memorized and written down. "These are significant doses," she said, frowning at the combination of antipsychotics and sedatives. "What symptoms were you experiencing that warranted this level of pharmaceutical intervention?" According to my son and Dr. Patterson, I was having memory problems, behavioral changes, and paranoid episodes, I said. But here's what they didn't document. Every symptom they described began after I started taking the medications they prescribed. I wasn't confused before Dr. Patterson. I was confused because of Dr. Patterson. I explained how Lucas had systematically isolated me from friends and family members who might have questioned his narrative, how he'd brought witnesses to observe my medicated behavior while claiming it was evidence of natural decline, how he'd used my trust in him to gain access to my finances and legal documents. Dr. Chen, I said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone whose life depended on being believed, I'm not asking you to take my word for any of this. I'm asking you to investigate. Look at my employment records. I worked until January with no performance issues. Look at my medical history before this year. No psychiatric hospitalizations, no cognitive complaints. Look at the medications I'm currently prescribed and compare them to what's actually necessary for someone with my presentation. She was taking detailed notes now, asking specific questions about dates, dosages, and procedures that demonstrated she understood the medical aspects of what I was describing. When I mentioned that I'd been secretly avoiding some of my medications and had noticed significant improvement in my cognitive function, she looked up sharply. You've been avoiding prescribed medications? As an experiment, I said carefully, to determine whether my confusion was caused by an underlying condition or by the medications themselves. The results have been illuminating. Dr. Chen closed her notebook and looked at me for a long moment. Mrs. Rodriguez, if what you're telling me is accurate, this would represent a serious case of elder abuse and possibly criminal fraud. Are you prepared for the consequences of making these accusations against your son and Dr. Patterson? Dr. Chen, I said, meeting her gaze with all the strength I had left. I'm prepared for anything except spending the rest of my life drugged into submission while my son profits from my imprisonment. I'd rather die fighting than live as a victim. After Dr. Chen left, the atmosphere at Riverside changed subtly but unmistakably. The staff seemed nervous, conferring in whispered conversations that stopped when I approached. Dr. Ari Patterson made an unscheduled visit to review my treatment plan, spending an unusual amount of time studying my chart and asking pointed questions about my recent behavior. The nurses report that you've been more alert lately, he said, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that hadn't been there before. How are you feeling about your medications? Any side effects we should address? I smiled, the same compliant smile I'd been giving him for months. I'm feeling much better, doctor. More stable. I think the treatment is really helping. He seemed satisfied with this response, but I noticed he adjusted my medication orders that day, increasing dosages for several of the drugs I'd been avoiding. The message was clear. If I was becoming too alert, too coherent, the solution was more chemical suppression, not less. But it was too late. Dr. Chen had listened, had taken notes, had asked the kinds of detailed questions that suggested she was taking my accusations seriously. Helen confirmed my suspicions when she whispered during her next shift that the state health department had requested all my medical records, including documentation from before my admission to Riverside. They're also asking for financial records, she told me as we pretended to review my evening medications. Seems they want to understand who's been paying for your care and where the money came from. Lucas visited me 2 days after Dr. Chen's review, and I could see immediately that something had changed. His usual mask of concerned devotion was slipping, replaced by barely controlled anxiety. He sat across from me in the visiting room, drumming his fingers on the table and avoiding eye contact in ways that reminded me uncomfortably of his childhood behavior when he'd been caught in lies. Mom, he said, his voice tighter than usual, the staff mentioned that you had a meeting with some kind of state inspector. What did you talk about? Oh, just routine questions, I said, maintaining the slightly confused tone that had become my protective camouflage. She wanted to know if I was happy here, if the staff was treating me well. Nice woman. She seemed very thorough. Lucas relaxed slightly, reassured by my apparently innocuous response. But I could see him calculating, wondering what I might have said, whether my medicated confusion would have prevented me from presenting any coherent complaints about my treatment. That's good, he said, reaching across to pat my hand with false affection. I'm glad they're making sure you're getting the best care. Dr. Patterson says you're responding well to the medications. Maybe soon we can talk about transitioning you to that assisted living facility I mentioned. The assisted living facility, Another cage with a prettier name, where I'd be surrounded by people who actually needed care, making it even easier to hide one person who was being systematically silenced. But as I looked at Lucas, at the man who'd once been my baby, my pride, my reason for working double shifts and sacrificing everything for his future, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. He was trapped too, in his own way, by greed and selfishness, and the kind of moral emptiness that made it possible to destroy your own mother for money. "Whatever you think is best," I told him, squeezing his hand with what he interpreted as maternal trust, but which was actually something much more complex: the touch of someone saying goodbye to an illusion that had already died. After he left, I sat in my room and waited. Dr. Chen had said the investigation would take time, that these cases required careful documentation and coordination between multiple agencies, but I could feel momentum building, like a storm system gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon. For the first time in almost a year, I wasn't just surviving from one day to the next. I was planning for a future that extended beyond these walls, beyond Lucas's control, beyond the chemical fog that had nearly succeeded in erasing me completely. The scared, confused woman who'd been brought to Riverside 6 months ago was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, more dangerous than Lucas had ever imagined possible. Someone who remembered exactly who she used to be. The day everything unraveled for Lucas began with Detective Sarah Martinez arriving at Riverside at 8:30 on a Thursday morning, accompanied by 2 social workers and an attorney from the district attorney's office. I was in group therapy, pretending to listen to Janet discuss coping strategies for memory-related anxiety, when Helen appeared in the doorway and caught my eye. The look on her face told me everything I needed to know. It was happening. "Miriam Rodriguez," Detective Martinez said when I was brought to the conference room where Dr. Chen had interviewed me 3 weeks earlier. "I'm investigating allegations of elder abuse and financial fraud. I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that you have the right to legal representation during this conversation." Legal representation? For a moment, the words didn't seem real. For almost a year, I'd existed in a legal limbo where other people made decisions about my life, my health, my future. The idea that I might have rights that needed protecting felt like waking up from a long nightmare. "I don't need a lawyer," I said, looking directly at Detective Martinez with all the clarity I'd been hiding for months. "I need someone to listen to the truth." What followed was the most important conversation of my life. Detective Martinez was thorough, professional, and most crucially, skeptical of easy answers. She'd already been investigating for 2 weeks, following up on Dr. Chen's referral, and what she'd discovered had apparently convinced her that my accusations warranted serious criminal investigation. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, consulting a thick file of documents, "we've been looking into your financial records, medical history, and the timeline of events you described to Dr. Chen. What we've found is concerning." She spread papers across the table: bank statements, property records, medical files, insurance claims. Seeing my life reduced to documentary evidence was surreal, but also validating. The pattern Lucas had thought was invisible became obvious when viewed by trained investigators who understood financial crimes. "Your house was sold for $430,000, Detective Martinez continued. "The proceeds went into an account controlled solely by your son. Since your admission to this facility, he's been withdrawing significant amounts monthly, ostensibly for your care, but the actual cost of your treatment here is being covered by your Medicare and Social Security benefits. $430,000. My life's work, my security, my legacy, being systematically stolen while I was chemically restrained and unable to protest. But now, finally, someone with authority was paying attention to the mathematics of my destruction. We've also reviewed your medical records from before January of this year," she said. "No history of psychiatric illness, cognitive decline, or behavioral problems. Your employment record shows consistent performance as a registered nurse until the day you allegedly became incompetent to manage your own affairs." The word allegedly was beautiful. It suggested doubt about the official narrative, recognition that my sudden transformation from competent professional to confused patient was too convenient to be credible. Detective Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. Mrs. Rodriguez, based on our investigation, we believe you've been the victim of systematic elder abuse. We're prepared to file charges against your son and Dr. Patterson, but we need your cooperation and testimony. What kind of charges? I asked, though part of me was afraid to hope for real justice. Financial exploitation of an elderly person, fraud, conspiracy, and potentially unlawful imprisonment, she said. If convicted, your son could face significant prison time and be required to make full restitution. Prison time, restitution, words that meant accountability, consequences, justice for someone who'd thought he was immune to all three. The next few hours moved with the swift efficiency of legal machinery finally grinding into motion. Dr. Patterson was arrested at his office that afternoon. Helen heard about it from another nurse whose husband worked at the medical building. Lucas was taken into custody at his workplace, let out in handcuffs while his colleagues watched the man they'd respected revealed as someone who'd systematically abused his own mother for money. But the moment I'd been waiting for came 2 days later, when I was called to testify before a judge about my competency and my wishes regarding my own care. The hearing was held in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and serious decisions, with Lucas sitting at a defendant's table beside a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I walked into that courtroom wearing clothes Helen had helped me select from the donations closet, a navy blue dress that fit reasonably well and made me look like the professional I'd once been, rather than the patient I'd been forced to become. My hair was clean and styled, my posture straight, my expression clear and determined. Lucas looked up when I entered, and for just a moment, I saw something in his eyes that might have been recognition of what he'd really done. Not just stolen money or property, but tried to erase the woman who'd given him life, who'd sacrificed everything for his welfare, who'd loved him more than she'd loved herself. Mrs. Rodriguez, the judge said, a woman in her 60s who reminded me of my former supervisor at the hospital. I've reviewed the investigation into your circumstances. Before we proceed, I need to determine your current mental competency. Are you taking any medications that might affect your ability to understand these proceedings? Your Honor, I said, standing as straight as I had during nursing school graduation 32 years earlier. I have been secretly refusing most of the medications prescribed to me for the past 2 months. I wanted to determine whether my confusion was caused by illness or by drugs that were unnecessary and harmful. The improvement in my mental clarity has been dramatic. The judge raised an eyebrow. You've been refusing prescribed medications? Yes, Your Honor. As a registered nurse with 30 years of experience in psychiatric care, I recognized that the medications I was being given were not appropriate for my condition. They were designed to create cognitive impairment, not treat it. I testified for 45 minutes, explaining the timeline of my abuse with the systematic precision I'd once brought to patient assessments. I described Lucas's manipulation, Dr. Patterson's complicity, the systematic isolation that had made me vulnerable to financial exploitation. I provided specific dates, amounts, and medical details that demonstrated not only my current competency, but my understanding of how that competency had been systematically undermined. When Lucas's attorney tried to cross-examine me, suggesting that my accusations were the product of paranoid delusions, I responded with the calm professionalism that had carried me through 3 decades of dealing with difficult doctors, challenging patients, and bureaucratic obstacles. Counselor, I said, I understand why these accusations might seem incredible. Sons aren't supposed to systematically abuse their mothers for financial gain, but the documentary evidence supports every claim I've made, and the improvement in my mental function since reducing my medication demonstrates that my confusion was chemically induced, not organically caused. The judge's ruling was swift and unequivocal. My guardianship was revoked immediately. I was released from Riverside that afternoon. Lucas's access to my accounts was terminated, and a forensic accountant was appointed to trace every dollar he'd stolen and ensure its return. But the moment that mattered most came when the judge addressed Lucas directly, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority that transcended legal procedure. Mr. Rodriguez, she said, looking at him with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for the most serious betrayals of trust. You systematically abused a woman who loved you, who sacrificed for you, who trusted you with her welfare. You used her love as a weapon against her. And you attempted to destroy her mind and steal her life's work for your own financial benefit. This court finds your actions not only criminal, but morally reprehensible. Lucas didn't look at me when the handcuffs were applied. He stared at the floor while the bailiff led him away to await trial, to face the consequences of treating his mother like a commodity, to be exploited rather than a human being deserving of love and respect. Walking out of that courthouse, breathing air that tasted like freedom for the first time in almost a year, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, exactly, but a profound sense of restoration, not just of my legal rights or my financial assets, but of my identity as someone who mattered, someone whose voice deserved to be heard, someone whose existence had value beyond what others could extract from it. The scared, confused woman who'd been dragged into Riverside no longer existed. In her place stood someone who'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that love without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and that sometimes the most important fight of your life is the one where you defend your right to remain yourself. 6 months after walking out of that courthouse, I'm sitting in the garden of my new home, a small but comfortable house 3 towns away from where Lucas and I shared what I once thought was love, but now understand was a transaction that had run its course the moment I became more valuable to him as a victim than as a mother. The forensic accountant recovered almost all of the money Lucas had stolen. After legal fees and the costs of rebuilding my life, I had enough to buy this place outright. No mortgage, no debt, no financial obligations to anyone who might use my vulnerability against me. Independence, I've learned, isn't just about having your own money. It's about ensuring that money can't be taken from you by people who claim to love you. Helen visits me every few weeks. She left Riverside 6 months after I did, unable to continue working in a system that had enabled my abuse for so long. She's working at a rehabilitation center now, helping stroke patients regain their independence. Work that feeds her soul instead of just paying her bills. You saved yourself, she tells me during our conversations over coffee in my sunny kitchen. I just helped you remember who you were, but I know better. Helen was the bridge between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. Without her willingness to see beyond the official diagnosis, to trust her professional instincts over institutional authority, I might still be drugged into submission somewhere, slowly disappearing while Lucas continued his methodical theft of everything I'd worked for. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified twice, once as a victim, and once as an expert witness regarding the medications that had been used to compromise my mental function. Dr. Patterson's license was revoked permanently. He pled guilty to conspiracy and fraud, receiving 2 years in prison and the complete destruction of his medical career. Lucas fought the charges until the end, maintaining through his lawyer that he'd been acting in my best interests, that my accusations were the product of mental illness and family dysfunction. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. 5 years in prison, full restitution, a restraining order that prevents him from contacting me for the remainder of his sentence, and 3 years beyond that. I watched the verdict being read with the same professional detachment I'd once brought to difficult medical procedures. Lucas had made his choices systematically and deliberately, and now he was experiencing the consequences of those choices. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no joy in his downfall. What I felt was completion, the sense that a long, painful chapter of my life had finally ended. The prosecutor approached me after the sentencing, a young woman who'd treated my case with the seriousness it deserved. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, "I want you to know that your testimony has helped us understand patterns we've seen in other elder abuse cases. Would you be willing to work with us as a consultant? Help us train investigators to recognize the signs of what happened to you?" That was how I found my new purpose. 3 days a week, I work with law enforcement agencies, social services departments, and medical professionals, teaching them to recognize the subtle signs of elder abuse that's disguised as concerned family intervention. I help them understand how easily a competent person can be made to appear incompetent through medication, isolation, and systematic gaslighting. The work is emotionally difficult, but profoundly meaningful. Every month, I help investigate cases similar to mine. Adult children who've decided their parents' assets are more valuable than their parents' autonomy. medical professionals who enable abuse through willful blindness or active complicity, legal systems that prioritize efficiency over individual rights. Some of the victims I work with are too damaged to recover fully. Years of chemical restraint and psychological manipulation have left them genuinely confused about their own histories, their own capabilities, their own worth. But others, like me, find their way back to themselves once the fog lifts and the truth becomes clear. I've learned that healing from betrayal, especially betrayal by someone you loved unconditionally, isn't about forgiveness. Forgiveness implies that the relationship can be restored, that trust can be rebuilt, that love can overcome the deliberate choice to destroy someone for personal gain. What Lucas did wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated campaign to erase me as a person while preserving me as a source of income. What I've found instead of forgiveness is something more valuable: clarity. I understand now that the son I thought I was sacrificing for never really existed. The boy I raised, the young man I supported, the adult I trusted with my future. He was always someone capable of seeing me as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be cherished. This understanding doesn't make me bitter. If anything, it's made me more compassionate toward other women who've spent decades loving people who were incapable of loving them back. I recognize the signs now, the small betrayals that prepare the ground for larger ones, the way someone can use your affection as leverage against your judgment, the gradual erosion of boundaries that makes complete exploitation possible. My new life is smaller than my old one, but infinitely more honest. I have a cat now, a gray tabby named Justice who appears at my door every evening when I return from work, as if he understands that both of us have survived situations that could have destroyed us. I have neighbors who know me as Miriam the consultant, not Miriam the victim. I have work that matters, money that's protected, and the kind of peace that comes from knowing that no one can ever again use my love as a weapon against me. Sometimes I think about the woman I was a year ago, confused, frightened, drugged into submission, disappearing a little more each day into someone else's definition of who I should be. She seems like someone I knew in another lifetime, someone I feel sorry for but can barely remember being. The woman I am now is harder, clearer, more dangerous to people who mistake kindness for weakness or mistake aging for vulnerability. I've learned that sometimes the most radical act of self-love is refusing to be destroyed by people who claim they're trying to help you. Last week, I received a letter from Lucas's prison. I didn't open it. Whatever he wants to say now, apology, justification, or manipulation disguised as family reconciliation, comes too late and matters too little. I've built a life that doesn't include him, doesn't need him, doesn't leave space for his particular brand of destructive love. Instead, I took the letter to my backyard and buried it beside the rose bush I planted when I first moved here. The roses are blooming now, red and defiant and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with anyone's approval or anyone's permission. I'm 56 years old. I have work that matters, money that's mine, and a future that belongs entirely to me. I've learned that it's never too late to save yourself, never too late to fight back, never too late to insist that your life has value beyond what others can take from it. Most importantly, I've learned that love without respect is just another form of abuse, and that the people who truly care about you will never ask you to disappear to make their lives easier. I survived. I fought back. I won. And every morning when I wake up in my own bed, in my own house, with my own choices spread out before me like a gift I finally learned I deserved, I remember that sometimes the most important victory is simply refusing to vanish when someone decides you're no longer worth keeping around. My name is Miriam Rodriguez. I'm a nurse, a survivor, and a woman who learned that her own voice was the most important sound she'd ever hear. And I'm still here.